This is Lecture 5, The Market for Goods and Services. You will find this material in Chapter 4 of Introduction to Macroeconomics by Paul Middleditch. In today's lecture, we will learn about the market for goods and services, how we model this market, and how we show equilibrium in the goods market. This gives us an opportunity to look at fiscal policy and two particular effects, the multiplier effect and the crowding out effect which results from fiscal policy. Lastly, we look at encompassing the open economy into the goods market, and that allows us to look at the case study of Brexit 2016. We begin by looking at the channels which transmit policy into the real economy. What are the connections between policy and economic activity? And for that we look at the interest rate and exchange rate channels. There are two transmission mechanisms in macroeconomics. One is for the closed economy, that's the interest rate transmission mechanism. And the other one is for the open economy, where it's the exchange rate that transmits policy into the real economy. So let's look at the example of both. For the interest rate transmission mechanism, there is a change in the money supply. This leads to a change in the interest rate, and because investment and saving depend on the interest rate, there is a change in the goods market. Effectively is a change in aggregate demand, and thus a change in either output or prices. Depends on the school of economic thought. For the open economy version, to be a change in the money supply will lead to a change in the demand for pounds in the foreign exchange markets. This will have an effect on the exchange rate, which will then affect the level of exports and imports in the economy, and that also affects aggregate demand, because aggregate demand in the open economy version has NX, which is exports minus imports. So there's a change in aggregate demand, and this will lead to either change in output or a change in prices, of course depending on the your school of thought, which one will change first or which one will change ultimately. We now look at ways that we can model the market for goods and services, which is the real side of the economy. Up until now, we've learned that the economy can be modeled via the circular flow of income, where production in firms leads to the employment of households, and that employment comes with income. Households can use that income to spend money on firms, and this completes the economy. Of course, we have complications to this. Households don't need to spend all their money on firms. They can withdraw money from the flow into these three sectors: the financial sector, the public sector, and the international sector. And in return, these sectors can pump money back into the flow. For the banking sector, this would be investment. For the public sector, this would be government expenditure. And for the international sector, this would be revenue for firms in the form of exports. But there is no way to show how demand in the economy can lead to changes in production, or national income. In a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, written by John Maynard Keynes in 1936, Keynes proposed that unlike the circular flow model, where injections and withdrawals act as the driving forces, that actually aggregate demand could also be thought of as a driver to changing output. So the distinction comes that we use expenditure, or certainly planned expenditures, as a proxy for aggregate demand, and we can derive a model that shows that output is driven by this demand. Of course, making the economy demand-driven has important consequences for monetary and fiscal policy. That the government or the central bank can change the economy effectively by trying to affect the level of demand in the economy. It's called demand management. So it's important for macroeconomic modelling. So we can model the goods market then by splitting expenditure into its components. And for the closed economy, we can have Y is equal to C plus I plus G. Consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, and government expenditure. Bearing in mind here an important distinction that consumption is total consumption, which is domestic consumption of domestic firms, plus imports, which is consumption on foreign firms. So total consumption equals domestic consumption plus imports. That's a very important digression there. The idea in the Keynesian model is that firms will produce whatever households demand. Equilibrium will come when what is being demanded is being produced by firms. We can model aggregate demand as planned expenditure. In other words, planned expenditure, C plus I plus G, is going to be our proxy for aggregate demand. And where demand is equal to what is actually being produced, we will have equilibrium. And we can imagine a situation where demand increases at the shops. This is going to lead producers to produce more. If demand is falling, this will encourage producers to produce less. So when they are not equal to each other, there is some change. But when they are equal to each other, there is no need for change. And we can show this no need for change or equilibrium condition by using a 45-degree line in a space where we have expenditure and output. Although we have that proposition in diagrams. In expenditure output space, we have equilibrium when expenditure is equal to output, and that's shown by the 45-degree line in our two-dimensional diagram. When what is being planned is being actually produced, so when demand is met exactly by firms, then there is no need for change in the market, we are in equilibrium. Now that we have our form for the equilibrium condition, we can discuss our form for expenditure. And here we can just imagine that the economy is just two-sector. In other words, they're just firms and households, just like our earlier description in the circular flow, where expenditure is equal to simply C, consumption. This is a simple case. Consumption here, total consumption, is equal to autonomous consumption plus some proportion of our income. So if income is zero, then there will be still some money spent on consumption. So this is autonomous level of consumption. How much more we spend as our income increases is given by the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC, which is also a key parameter in our model. But there is the consumption function, which is also the expenditure function here because E is equal to C. And in diagrammatic form, you can see that when income is equal to zero, there is some level of consumption given by A, but as income increases, expenditure or consumption also increases, but only by the proportion given by the marginal propensity to consume. Bear in mind that the marginal propensity to consume will be between 0 and 1, that's like a percentage. And A will be positive. Now we can construct the Keynesian cross, which is our model for the goods market, remember, using the equilibrium condition and the expenditure function. There is the equilibrium condition where y is equal to E at any point along that line. In expenditure E, output y space. For any given level of expenditure in the economy, the Keynesian cross will predict a level of income which will be achieved in equilibrium. And that equilibrium level of income is shown here as YE, where the expenditure function crosses the equilibrium condition. Remember that the slope of the expenditure function is also the marginal propensity to consume. It's the change in consumption that we get as a result of a change in income, Y. Up until now, we have assumed two-sector economy without just households and farms. Expenditure is exactly equal to consumption only, so E is equal to C. But now we can do a better job of modeling the goods market by relaxing that assumption. We can add the financial sector and the public sector. The financial sector being responsible for investment and the public sector being responsible for government spending. So now we return to E. Expenditure is equal to C plus I plus G. The three components of expenditure in a closed economy. First of all, we'll talk about the financial sector and how investment behaves. Investment and government spending are exogenous in the Keynesian cross because it's in expenditure output space. Neither investment nor government spending depend on expenditure or income. This is the assumption we make. However, investment is dependent on the interest rate, and we can bear this in mind for later. That investment is downward sloping in the interest rate. So at high interest rates, there is low investment. People are less willing to borrow money to invest in goods. And at lower interest rates, borrowing becomes more attractive. And firms will go out and households will go out to borrow more money, and investment will increase. We'll bear this in mind, but in our model, investment is still exogenous. So now we can produce a Keynesian cross by adding investment. There is our expenditure line, which now includes the two exogenous components, investment and government expenditure. Notice that the slope of the expenditure function is still the slope of the consumption function. All that we have done by adding investment and government expenditure is to shift the line upwards. In fact, we have increased the intercept. Because neither I nor G depend on expenditure or output. So adding these components are just intercept, adding amounts to the intercept. Now that we have the Keynesian cross model, we can use the model to analyze the economy from a disequilibrium situation. Now imagine that aggregate expenditure, which is also aggregate demand, exceeds national income, which is production. What will happen? So we are at a situation where demand given by our expenditure function is greater than actual output given by our equilibrium condition. We can see at this level of output, Y1, that demand is greater than actual output. There is excess demand in the economy. Naturally, we would expect firms to react by increasing production, so output will rise. What about the case, in the other case, where output, actual output, is greater than aggregate demand. So we're in a situation like Y2, and we can see here that the demand is below what is being produced. So there is a demand deficiency in the economy. Naturally, we would expect farms that have a lack of demand to reduce production. So we see output falling. So here the Keynesian cross is showing us how the economy reacts to market forces, always pushing it towards equilibrium. And when we get to equilibrium, there's no more driving force for change. And of course, finally, we show the situation after market forces, which is where the economy is in equilibrium, where aggregate demand in the economy is equal to output or production. The situation or the prediction of income given any level of expenditure by the Keynesian cross. We now go on to talk about fiscal policy, and we are able to do that because we have been modelling the goods market, and one of the variables that is assumed exogenous in a goods market is government expenditure. So we can now use this Keynesian cross to analyse fiscal policy. And two things that we will see, two effects that we will see from policy are the multiplier effect and the financial effect with the crowding out effect. What is fiscal policy? Just like monetary policy, fiscal policy seeks to control or manage demand in the economy by trying to reverse a situation of an economic boom where the economy is overheating, or an economic recession where the economy is slumped. And to do that, the government has two tools. One is to increase spending or to change taxation. The purpose of fiscal policy then, if one is to correct a fundamental disequilibrium, we might be in a demand deficiency situation in the Keynesian cross. One might be to fine-tune the economy to increase our normal level of output somewhat, or perhaps aggressively before an election. One other purpose is a good purpose, maybe to affect the economy in the long run through supply-side policies. We model fiscal policy through the government budget, which is taxation minus government spending, T minus G. Here we have some data from the UK for general government expenditure as a percentage of GDP. And the first thing to note here that it does appear cyclical. But is that the business cycle driving this expenditure or the political cycle? It's interesting. There might be changes in the direction of government spending depending on the political preference. Obviously, government expenditure does depend somewhat on the business cycle. When times are good, there's less draws on benefits and things like that. But there is definitely a political cycle here. So something to try to match up with the data. Alternatively, we can look at government spending as a snapshot. Here we've got the shares that sectors receive as a percentage of total government spending. And this data here is for 2015-16, that tax year. We can see that by far the biggest proportion of government spending goes on welfare. We might be happy about that. Secondly, health, and then third, state pensions. So we might say, well, that's fair enough. That's where we would expect these areas or sectors to sit in the terms of priorities. However, interestingly, education is then 12%, and national debt interest will be halfway down the list. This is something we need to think about, is spending 6% of all expenditure on servicing debt reasonable, somewhere we would want to be. Maybe some of that money could be spent on education or on health. So this is an interesting discussion to be had by looking at the percentages of where the government spends its money. Let's look at the terminology of government finance. As we said before, it's really the budget, government budget, that we model as fiscal policy. So for a budget surplus, we have that taxation, revenue from taxation, minus government spending. If that is positive, then there is a surplus. Though if that is negative, if government spending is greater than the level of revenue from taxation, then we have a budget deficit. Of course, we're used to budget deficits in this country. So the borrowing required for a particular period annually would be something we know as the public sector borrowing requirement. That's the difference between T and G in any one year. Of course, the accumulation of PSBRs, public sector borrowing requirements, is going to make up a level of general government debt. So if the government borrows money in one more period, debt will increase, but if the government manages not to spend all of this revenue, then the PSBR would be negative and general government debt would decrease. But just for interesting facts, for 2017 in the UK, our general debt was 82% of GDP. Put another way, that is 1.6 trillion pounds. And the interest the government is paying to service that debt is 50 billion pounds per year, or 136 million pounds per day. So we look at the payments for servicing debt on a percentage basis, we noted that it was between 6 and 7%. But when we see the actual figures, the actual money being spent, it might produce a different reaction. So it's important to convey information in different ways. Let's look at general government debt as a comparison across countries, and here we have that for the UK, that for the USA, and that for the Euro area. And we can see that for the US and Euro area, that since the 80s, the government debt as a percentage of GDP has been increasing, whilst in the early 80s, in fact, it was decreasing in the UK, with a turnaround in 1990, which was probably sparked by an economic slump in the UK. We see a reversing of that in 96 by the Conservatives and also Gordon Brown for a while, before there was a general reversal around early 2000s. And of course we can see that for all countries there was an explosion in debt around the time of the financial crisis. How does the government go about financing these public sector borrowing requirements? But it can do so by issuing bonds or gilts. And it can do that either to the central bank or to the private sector through the central bank. So if the government sells just to the central bank, the money will come from the central bank will hold the bonds, then it has effectively increased the money supply. There has been more money spent in the economy that's come from nowhere, so this is increasing the money supply. However, if the central bank goes on to sell those bonds to the public, those bonds will end up through financial markets in the hands of the public, and cash will flow the other way. This will have the effect of reducing the money supply back again to where it was. So if the government spends money and borrows from the central bank, this increases the money supply, but the central bank can sell those bonds that have been issued for the money and reverse the creation of money in the economy to reduce the money supply back again. We can show fiscal policy using our Keynesian cross model. We start in equilibrium, where the expenditure function, E, which is equal to C plus I plus G1, crosses the equilibrium condition Y is equal to E. So we start at Y1, and there is fiscal policy. An increase in G is going to shift the expenditure line upwards, Remember that G is exogenous in our model, so an increase in G just shifts the line up. Effectively, autonomous government expenditure has increased. As a result, we get an increase in output from Y1 to Y2. That's how the Keynesian cross shows fiscal policy. It's the shifting up and down of the expenditure line and a new prediction for equilibrium output each time. Notice something from the Keynesian cross, that the income, or the change in income, is larger than the change in government expenditure. Go back and check. Why is this? Money spent by the government initially is respent by other agents around the economy. So increasing G has effectively set up a chain reaction of transactions around the economy. So the eventual increase in output is going to be equal to much more than the initial increase in government expenditure. And this is something that we call the multiplier effect, where an increase in G leads to an increase in income via the income identity, but the increase in income also leads to an increase in consumption by the consumption function. With consumption rising, by the income identity, we see that Y, or output, increases again. Now we can show the multiplier effect using mathematics. So first of all, we set out our system of equations that describe our economy. We have the income identity, tells us that output moves, Y is equal to C plus I plus G, plus we have functional forms for the components. So consumption has a consumption function, C is equal to little a, autonomous consumption, plus B, which here is the marginal propensity to consume, times disposable income, Y minus T. We have that I is exogenous at I bar, G is exogenous at G bar, and T is exogenous at T bar. So we start by substituting these components into the original income identity. We replace C with the right-hand side of the consumption function, replace I with I bar, and G with G bar. So below we have the income identity, Y is equal to C plus I plus G, or by replacing with the functional forms, we have that Y is equal to A plus B times Y minus T bar plus I bar plus G bar. And we can multiply out some of this consumption function to give us something that's easier to solve. We can say, well, this is equivalent. Y is equal to A plus BY minus BT bar plus I bar plus G bar. In the previous slide, Y is on both the left and the right hand side, so we can begin to solve for Y by moving everything in Y to the left hand side. We'll do that here. Y minus BY was on the other side before, is equal to A minus BT bar plus I bar plus G bar. Simplifying the left hand side gives us 1 minus B times Y is equal to the same as before, and dividing everything by 1 minus B will help us to solve for Y. Now we can say that Y is equal to 1 over 1 minus B times the exogenous components A minus BT bar plus I bar plus G bar. So an increase in government expenditure will change output by a factor of 1 over 1 minus B. And this 1 over 1 minus B is in fact the multiplier. So we can say that the multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus B, but remembering that the parameter B was our marginal propensity to consume. So we can write the multiplier, there's a special M here, is equal to 1 over 1 minus the MPC. The amount that output will increase as a result of an increase in G will be given by 1 over 1 minus MPC. Now we have done this mathematically, we can also show this numerically, this multiplier effect. We start off with an initial increase in government expenditure of 160 million, and we set the marginal propensity to consume to 0.5. Now, given that we know that output will increase by 1 over 1 minus MPC, we know that we expect output to increase by 2 times. Notice that the increases in Y become smaller in each round. So there we have, in a table form, an increase in G of 160 will give us, by the income identity, a change in Y of 160. But because we spend half of new income, consumption will also increase by 80, which is half of 160. Remember, the MPC is 0.5. And this increase in consumption will lead to a further increase in Y, which will lead to a further increase in consumption, and so on. In fact, the ultimate change in output is 320, given an initial increase in G of 160 is times 2, which is what we predicted by our calculation of the multiplier. Now you might think that because of the multiplier effect that government policy or government expenditure increases in government expenditure. It might be a win-win situation. The more we spend, the more income goes up. However, there is a downside to government spending. Increasing expenditure also creates pressures in financial markets, so government spending comes at a cost. And let's look at that cost using the Keynesian cross and the money market together. We begin in equilibrium in the Keynesian cross and in the money market. Y is at Y dash and the interest rate is at R1. An increase in G increases output from Y dash to Y dash dash. Looks like a win-win situation. However, we've increased money demand in the money market. The higher output has also increased demand for money. The money demand increases, and this increases the interest rate from R1 to R2. What is the cost here? The increase in the interest rate is going to lower investment. So we begin back after the increase in G. We can see that an increase in R leads to lower investment by the investment function, so that the expenditure line shifts back down again and we're nearly back to where we were. So we started off with expansion from government expenditure, but contraction because of crowding out in the financial markets. Y has fallen back from Y dash dash to Y dash dash dash. Output's lower again. How much that crowding out will be determined by the slope of the interest rate function. We now go on to extend our model to encompass the open economy, which we can think of as the international sector. So how do we model the international sector? We do that by using the trade balance, net exports, which is exports minus imports. And we simply bolt that onto our income identity, so that now that Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. So we have a fourth component of expenditure, which comes from our interactions with the rest of the world. So what does our open economy Keynesian cross look like? Well, because net exports is also exogenous, the open economy version of the Keynesian cross looks very similar, except the fact that for expenditure we are also including NX. By extending the model to encompass the open economy, we can now use the Keynesian cross to look at study Brexit, which happened in 2016. Now we know from our earlier discussions that exchange rates and output tend to go in the opposite direction. An increase in the exchange rate is going to make our exports more expensive, and that's going to lower net exports and thus output. So now we can use the Keynesian cross to look at the prediction, which does contrast to the Bank of England's prediction. In the event of Brexit, the Bank of England predicted that the pound would fall sharply and that there would be a sharp slowdown in economic activity. In other words, there'd be a recession. But let's look, and which is contrasting to what the Keynesian cross was telling us, but let's look what it does tell us. We start with the market or international trade and the Keynesian cross together. Imagine that we are at the exchange rate, so this is the pound, exchange rate 1, where imports are high and exports are low, so we have a trade deficit, which is what we have in the UK, and that at that level of NX we also have a level of output from the Keynesian cross, which E equals C plus I plus G plus NX1. Now, we vote for Brexit. There is a sharp fall in the pound, so the imports fall back and exports increase. There is an increase in NX, and we see that the expenditure line shifts upwards, giving us a prediction that output will rise. So that is in sharp contrast to the prediction given by the Bank of England. However, which is correct? This is the textbook response, and it was the textbook explanation that was correct. In fact, we had a fall in sterling, and since then we've had economic growth, not a recession. So we'll see how we can use it to analyze case studies like Brexit.